So Mary Carol, we're here with you in your garden, and my first question for you is, how long have you been doing this?
Well, how long have I been doing this? This garden is probably started about this particular one within the last decade, but it has expanded greatly. But prior to that, I've been gardening probably for a total of 40 years,
Okay,
something
so
like that.
most of your adult life.
Yes, for sure. Each home I've lived in, each apartment I've lived in, I've had some sort of little garden, whether it be vegetable garden or a perennial flower garden. And this one is both.
Nice. So if there's someone who's just getting into gardening, what would you tell them? What advice would you give them to get them started?
Start small.
Yeah.
And start with finding out, well, I'd say make a decision between vegetables and flowers. If you want to do both, okay, but you probably want to start small with both of those. See what kind of plot you have, and it can be as small as your porch. It can be as large as your backyard. And but make a decision that you're going to care for it, and I would say it's just start with what you have, because otherwise you'll be overwhelmed.
Yeah. And so I'm guessing you maybe put in 10 to 15 hours a week in here. Does that sound like a good ballpark?
It really depends on the time of year. So I start a lot of my seeds pretty early. I start some things in February inside, and then I'm starting seeds up through the end of April, and then I start bringing them out through the summer, and I'd say the season wraps up in November with the planting of the garlics and the shallots. But I'd say the actual time spent in the garden is mostly in the early spring. And then in the summer, it's a lot of harvesting and picking and maintenance. And then come August and September, you're ready to begin to put some beds to bed. But you're still working other things at the same time.
Right. So it sounds like it's 8 or 9 months a year. You're really working on it.
Yep. And you need winter to plan, to think about seeds, to plan what the garden's going to look like the following year. I do a lot of rotating through my garden beds, so I have to really kind of make decisions where I'm going to put what. And for instance, these are the peas right behind you here. And those peas and other legumes like beans are really great for feeding the soil. So after the peas are in, probably next year, that will be more fruits, like maybe the tomatoes will go there, or the cucumbers. So I'm very deliberate about where I plant what. But yeah, getting back to your first question, the number of hours a week, probably, I'd say 2 hours a day is probably a good guess.
Okay, for a big garden.
For a big garden.
Right. And I noticed that almost everything in here is either in a garden bed, or at the very least it has a 2x4 or 4x4 around it. Why is that? What's the advantage?
Yeah, so you're referring to the raised beds, mostly. There's there's advantages and disadvantages to that. What you can't see right now, which is out of the camera, is I've got some much higher raised beds. Those are just easier to access. The nice thing about a raised bed is you can control what's in it a little bit more in terms of the soil. But they tend to dry out a little more quickly, so they may require more watering. It's also just easier to care for. What, again, you can't see, but behind the camera, you'll get it later, there's some winter squash beds, and those are ground level, which is nice because they spread and they need a lot of room. So those I prefer to have in the ground, as well as the potatoes, which are way back there. Those really need to be in the ground. So it's a mix. It does get to be difficult to mow in here, which is part of the disadvantage of all of these raised beds, mowing and trimming.
Okay, but it makes weeding easier, especially these higher raised beds, you don't have to bend over as much.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the encroachment of the grass that's coming into the ground level beds is just much easier to control. I still get a lot of weeds in those raised beds, especially depending on what kind of compost I'm using. If I've purchased anything from a local nursery, I'm not really sure what seeds are in there at times. I try to be really careful, but I'm constantly weeding, whether the beds are raised or in the ground. That's always a task. And you have to kind of enjoy weeding,
Yeah.
I'd say. It becomes something that you really put your heart into, and sort of a Zen-like experience.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
And well, speaking of soil, are you just using topsoil from around the garden here, or do you put anything into it?
That's a little bit of a disadvantage of the raised beds, because they get a lot of droppage of the soil level every year. So I do have to constantly replenish them. So I tend to buy a few yards of a combined soil compost blend in the spring from a local gentleman, and then we also have our own compost pile that I'm adding to that from. And I also put a layer of compost from our personal pile on in the fall. It's almost like the blanket that I'm putting on before it goes to sleep. And then
Nice.
that decomposes over the winter, and come April, or hopefully sooner if the weather's good, I'm doing some just really I don't till it over. I'm just using a fork to aerate it throughout the early part of the season.
Okay.
Yeah.
And speaking of your compost pile, I think there's one or two things that you're not supposed to put in compost. Is that right?
People have different opinions. Yeah. I definitely wouldn't put any diseased plants in there. So, for instance, depending on the season, so far so good, knock on wood, my tomatoes look okay, but I have had a variety of tomato diseases over the years, as well as some squash problems, and I won't put those in the compost, just for fear of it harboring over winter and coming back. So I will bag those up and put them, unfortunately, in plastic bags and send them out to the trash. But that would be the main thing. As far as we throw our kitchen wastes in there. Mostly it's organic waste material I'm putting in there. I typically don't put any animal materials in there. Just mostly
So no
vegetable.
chicken bones.
No chicken bones. Mostly because I know a particular dog who might get some.
Yeah.
But no, I'll put a lot of our organic waste from the kitchen in there, and then from the garden, it just goes right back in. But other than that, a lot of grass clippings and various clippings from around the property here, we put it all in.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a good way to just keep the cycle going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And returning to the question of seeds and beginning gardeners, if someone's beginning a garden and they've never done it before, are there any plants that are particularly easy to grow that you would recommend?
Again, coming back to vegetable versus flowers, I would suggest, if you're a beginning gardener, just starting from plants that are already started and not starting your own seeds indoors. That takes a little more commitment to do that, a little more space, a little more time. So for instance, if you're doing vegetable gardening and you want peppers and tomatoes, start with starts from your local, maybe there's a CSA, community supported agriculture, that you can tap into that sells plants, or your local nursery, and get a variety that you like and start that way. Seeds are very easy to start right directly in your garden for certain plants. So for instance, lettuces, kale, most greens, Swiss chard, spinach, those can all be started from seed right there in your garden. And Generally on the back of the seed packet, it tells you, depending on what zone we live in, the best time of year to start those seeds. Flowers, kind of the same advice. Flowers, depending on an annual versus a perennial, can be just easier to start by getting the actual seedlings started from your nursery. And but on that note, I would highly recommend going with your native plants. And a lot of local nurseries don't necessarily have a great selection. So you can go online and you can look for native plants from your area. There's tons of resources out there. I would start with something called the Homegrown National Park website. Doug Tallamy started that. And there's a whole, I think there's resources that are listed depending on the area that you live in to get the native seeds.
Okay.
So that's a good start.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Very nice. Is there anything you've tried growing that just hasn't worked at all? Or you say, I'm never doing this again?
When I first started this garden, it was much smaller, and I really tried to grow some cabbages, some broccoli, and some cauliflower. Those are in the brassica family, and I had cabbage worms just eating them all over the place. The same would go for the Brussels sprouts, although behind the camera there, I've got some pretty successful Brussels sprouts going there, so I take that back, that I'll never do it again. But I think every year I like to try something new and challenge myself, and really the pests that you get in the garden generally change from year to year, so there's no predicting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's I think it just depends on how much rain we've had, you know, how much attention I've been giving to the garden to keep up with the pests, which is part of why rotating the plants around, just to make sure that I'm not using the soil in the same way year after year, and that helps. So as far as nothing, probably not. I'm not a huge fan of beets, but I planted beets this year and they're doing pretty well, mostly because I like to put beets in brownies.
Yummy.
So that's something that has been a success this year.
That's good. And all of this, you're not using any pesticides either. This is all organic. So
All organic.
It's possible to do all of this without spraying it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't, I occasionally will put an organic fertilizer in the soil, just a little bit of a granular fertilizer, as well as like a fish emulsion spray that I'll use just to feed the plants, particularly the longer lived plants like the garlic and some of the onions. The fertilizer that I put in the soil that's organic, I'll just put like a tablespoon or two in, depending on the length of the row, and I'll mix that in with the soil before I reseed it, so that it has more nutrients for like the next succession, especially if it's another succession of plants that I'm putting in there. But yeah, no pesticides. The only thing I have used is neem oil, which is considered okay for organic gardens. It's a spray, and I've used that on the asparagus beetle that occasionally infests the asparagus early on, as well as I had something that was going after the yarrow, which is this plant right here, last year, and I used the neem oil on that. And it proved my point. The yarrow this year has nothing to do with the neem oil, but it's doing very well. So whatever that insect was that was plaguing it last year is not doing so this year. Another thing that we might want to just quickly talk about is something called companion planting. And so when we look at this bed here, for instance, the tomato bed, and there's also peppers in here, and you'll see the marigolds. I started the marigolds from seed. But certain plants do well both as a natural deterrent. The marigolds, for instance, supposedly deter little rabbits, which I'm not so sure that's true, as we've had quite a few of them in here this year. But there's also some herbs, some parsley, and some basil in here. So certain plants really like to be near other plants, and they help in terms of resisting pests, for instance, that might be attacking the one are going to be turned off by the presence of the other plant in the garden. So I try to really, again, coming back to planning out your beds, think about that as you're getting started.
Yeah, that's really good to know. That's something people might not think of when they're just getting into this.
Yeah. The onions, for instance, they do really well on the edges of the bed. I think, I'm not sure if this is true, but I think one of the things that I've noticed is what works well in a bed is generally what works well on a plate. So if the carrots and the tomatoes are in the same bed, you know, or they're a succession bed, generally they go okay on a plate together. The basil and the tomatoes go really well together. So that's kind of a nice rule of thumb.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. And it just all looks good.
Yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
important too. It does.
Absolutely.
It looks great here. It looks
Yeah.
super nice.
I think that is coming back to that original question that you had, Sam, that about where should people start. Do what feels visually appealing, because that, as well as you know, with your palate, because that will help you continue. You know, if you don't enjoy it, if you can't reap the benefits of it, you won't want to continue. But if you're able to eat it and you enjoy what you're eating and you're sharing it with friends and you love just looking around the garden every day, then you'll keep doing it.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to stop. Thanks for sharing
Sounds
all of
good.
this with us.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thanks for being interested.
Yep, for sure.